Okay, so we are talking about quadratic and square root functions as inverses. So we talked about inverses earlier in the unit. We said that to find the inverse coordinate points, all you had to do was switch the x and y value. So basically, our first coordinate point and our second coordinate point, which was the inverse, ended up being complete opposites. So right here, they say that the two functions y equals x squared and y equals the square root of x are what? Well, squaring something and taking the square root of something are opposites. Therefore, these two functions are inverses. We also discussed in, I believe it was 7.2, that the notation for an inverse is written just like this. So we have to have this little -1 here. So we would be able to say, if you were given the function f of x equals x squared, that the square root of x is its inverse, which we denote like this. So that being said, inverse functions have certain properties. We know already for coordinate points that the domain of f of x becomes the range. We switch their places. The range will become the domain. Therefore, the x and y values for f of x switch for an inverse. All right, so we will now find the inverse of a given function. So before, we were given two functions and determining if those were inverses of each other. So we had one to plug into the other. Here, we are just given one function, and we will determine whether we will determine what its inverse is. So it says that our first step is always to replace f of x with y. Ours does not have an f of x, it's already a y, so that one's already taken care of for us. It then says to swap the positions of x and y. So instead of a y here, I'm going to change it out for an x. And instead of x squared, I'm going to change that out for a y squared plus 4. All right. Now, if we want to be able to find this function, we have to get y by itself, right? We know that's what a function looks like. Y equals your equation. So the first thing we would do to get y squared by itself would be to move this 4. It's a positive 4, so to move it, I would subtract it. And now I would have x minus 4 over here, can't combine them because they're different, equals y squared. Now, we need to get rid of this square here. The opposite of squaring something is to take its square root, and if you do something to one side, got to do it to the other. So now, all I have over here is y. So I'm going to go ahead and write that on this side, because that's normally, we normally see our y written on the left. Equals the square root of x minus 4. So we have now solved for y. Our last step, it says, is that we need to replace y with f inverse of x. So f inverse of x instead of y equals the square root of x minus 4. And there's our answer. All right, let's do another one. So first step is to replace f of x with y. So this one does have an f of x. I'm going to take that out, change it to y. So we have y equals 2x squared minus 6, and they say that we now need to swap x and y. So now I'm going to have x equals 2y squared minus 6. And now we solve for y. So our first step would be to add 6 to both sides. So if I add 6 here, add 6 here, I now have x plus 6 equals 2y squared. All right, Now I need to get rid of the 2. So I'm going to divide by 2. Now that that has gone away, all I'm left with is y squared. And to get rid of a square, I simply take the square root. Now, we are taking the square root of this entire side. So this is like having the square root of x plus 6 over the square root of 2 is equal to y. Now, we are almost done, but we do not like having square roots in the bottom of a fraction. So, to get rid of the square root around the 2, you multiply it times itself. But rules say if you do something to the bottom of the fraction, also have to do it to the top. So now I just need to multiply this together. I'll have the square root of 2 times the square root of x plus 6. I'm basically just multiplying the 2 by what is underneath the square root. So I would then have 2x plus 12 underneath the square root over, I have, if I multiply my numbers underneath the square root, I would have 2 times 2, which is 4. The square root of 4 is actually 2. So we have gotten rid of the square root in the bottom. And we do need to replace that y with the inverse, like our step 4 says to do. All right, example number 3. Our f of x is already a y, so we're good there. Now we just have to swap the x and the y. So I'll have x equals y plus 2 squared. All right, so I cannot break up what is in the parentheses. I have to get rid of that square first. To get rid of a square, we take the square root. All right, so now I have the square root of x equals y plus 2, because we got rid of that square. Now I need to move the 2 to the other side, so I would do that by subtracting. I cannot combine these, so I'm going to move the y to the left. That's where we normally see it. I'm going to have the square root of x minus 2, since I can't combine those. And our last step is to replace y with the inverse. So here is my final answer. All right. Number 4. So this one does have f of x. I'm going to change that to a y. And then I'm supposed to swap x and y. So now I'm going to have x equals 4 times y minus 5 squared. All right, so my first step is to get rid of that 4. So it's being multiplied times my parenthesis. So I'm going to divide by 4. So I now have x over 4 equals y minus 5 squared. To get rid of the square, we take the square root. Remember, that means taking the square root of the top and the bottom. All right. Now, we would have the square root of x. I can actually simplify this because the square root of 4 is 2. Is equal to y minus 5. My last step would be to move this 5 over by adding it. I'm going to move my y over here to the left. So I'm going to have y equals over 2. And to move it over here, I had to add that 5. So I'm going to have plus 5 on the end. And my last step is to replace y with the inverse. And there's my answer. All right, example number 5. So already is a y, we just need to switch x and y. So I'll have x equals 2 parentheses y plus 3 squared minus 4. And now we solve for y. So I'm going to add 4 first. So if I add 4 to move it over here, I now have x plus 4 equals 2 parentheses y plus 3 squared. Now I need to get rid of the 2 by dividing. I'm going to divide both sides by 2, which will make those cancel out. So now all I have over here is y plus 3 squared, and I cannot currently break that up because it's in parentheses. So to get rid of the square, we take the square root. Remember, that means I take the square root of everything over here on the other side. So this is very similar to the one right above it, right? We don't want a square root in the bottom of our fraction. So to get rid of it, since I cannot take the square root of 2 and get a whole number, I multiply it by itself. And rules say if you do something to the bottom of the fraction, you also have to do it to the top. So up here in the top, I'm multiplying what I have underneath the square roots. So I have 2 times x, which would give me 2x, and 2 times 4, which would give me 8, all still under the square root. Here, I have the square root of 2 times the square root of 2. So if I multiply what's underneath there, I end up with the square root of 4. But just like we said up here, the square root of 4 is actually 2. So when I rewrite, I'll change this to a 2. And on this side, now that we have gotten rid of this square by taking the square root, all I'm left with is y plus 3. So now I have to move that 3 over by subtracting it. So now I'm going to move my y over and write it on the left. So I'll have the square root of 2x plus 8 over what was the square root of 4, but the square root of 4 is just 2. So we've gotten rid of our square root in the bottom. And then I still have this minus 3 out here on the end. And my last step is to change out the y for the inverse. And there's my final answer. All right, last example. Number 6 does have an f of x. It says that we're supposed to change that to a y. So once I change that to a y, all I need to do is swap the x and y's positions. So I will now have x equals negative 3 times y minus 4 squared plus 2. And we now solve for y. So I would start by moving the 2. If I move the 2, I have to subtract it. I would then have x minus 2 equals negative 3 times y minus 4 squared. I would now need to divide by negative 3. I divide both sides by negative 3, and those go away. So now the only thing I need to get rid of so that I can separate this y and negative 4 is to get rid of the square, which I do by taking the square root. You take the square root of one side, you got to take the square root of the other side, which means both top and bottom. So this is similar to this problem over here, right? And this one here. We now have a square root in the bottom, which we don't like. So remember, to get rid of that square root, you're just going to multiply it times itself. So I'm going to multiply the bottom by the square root of negative 3. If you do it to the bottom, got to do it to the top as well. So I'm going to multiply the square root of negative 3 times the square root of x minus 2. We multiply the numbers underneath. Negative 3 times x is negative 3x. -3 times -2 is +6, and it is still underneath that square root. Here I have the square root of -3 times the square root of -3. Multiplying the numbers, -3 times -3 is +9. All right. And now all that's left over here is y minus 4. This does become something where we can get rid of the square root, right? The square root of 9 is 3. So when I rewrite, I'm going to change this to a 3. Now I need to move this 4 over, get the y by itself. So now I'm going to write the y on the left. I'll have the square root of -3x plus 6, which was over the square root of 9, but the square root of 9 is just 3. And we still have this plus 4 out here on the end. And our final step is to replace the y with the inverse. Inverse of x equals the square root of -3x plus 6 over 3. Oops. Sorry. 3 plus 4. So if we go back and look at our answers, even the ones that have a fraction in their answer, none of them have a square root in the bottom. So that is our goal. We don't want any square roots in the bottoms of any fractions. If you do, you're going to have to do what we did on numbers 2, 5, and 6. So these 4 steps will be what we follow every single time.